outside of Washington, D.C. And one night, my mother, she slowly walked into the room that I was in. And I could see that she was crying. This was the night she told me that she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And for those of you here today who have dealt with something like that personally, you know that when you hear news like that, your mind, it just races with questions about what's to come. The only thing you can think about is what's next. But her tears that night, they weren't tears from thoughts of the chemo, the radiation, the surgery, the physical pain that she would eventually go through. No. They were from thoughts of the past. See, for 25 years at this point in her life, she had worked at a job after college, slowly rising up the set ranks in front of her. But this was the night, the first time that she told me her true dream of wanting to open a jewelry store, and how she loved building things and always saw herself as someone who would work creatively. And she spent hours telling me all these different stories of regret about things that she didn't do, and how her mindset had been trained throughout her life to avoid taking a risk. I want to tell you a little bit about where I come from. So both of my parents are from the South. My dad's from a small town outside of Savannah, Georgia. And my mother, she's from a small town outside of Columbia, South Carolina. It's called Winsboro. Has anyone heard of it? 2 people? Okay. So that Winsboro is where I spent my summers growing up. And my mother, she was one of 8 siblings, my aunts and uncles. And they all grew up, they were born and raised in a 1-bedroom house that was a fraction of the size of this room today. But what they lacked in money and what they lacked in material possessions, they made up for very well in status in the local community. You see, my mom, her 2 older brothers, my uncles, were the first 2 in town to go to college. One of her sisters was a star basketball player, my aunt. She even got the key to the city. Her older sister, my mom's older sister, my aunt, was a student body president every year, straight A's every semester. And so in that house they grew up in, while the inside of their refrigerator was empty on some nights, the outside of that fridge was always packed. It was always covered with collages of newspaper clippings, of report cards, any artifact that could be the symbol of success. And so there was this feeling for my mother that if she deviated from this track at all, if she didn't follow the standard, then she could lose everything. And that life seemed so fragile that any wrong move, any misstep could break the ground below her. And so what did she do? She taught herself how to tiptoe through life, to walk lightly on life, never daring to stray away from the straight line that was in front of her, and never daring to make an imprint on the world with her own 2 feet. And so we spent hours talking about this to 2 or 3 a.m. that night. And she was telling me all these stories of sadness and regret, but I'll never forget it because there was this beautiful moment where in the midst of all of this, I saw a second person in her eyes. And that second person was free, because at that moment they realized that these limitations, these restrictions that had guided her throughout her life were now insignificant in comparison. And I'll never forget it. It was like 3 a.m. in my room. And it was the end of the conversation. And she just smiled at me and said, "Well, I guess I have nothing to lose now." And that's when it hit me, that I was going to do everything I could to be that second person I saw within her. Someone who was free to take risks, to bring all of myself to the world. You see, the truth is, I started playing the violin when I was 3 years old. And even when I was very, very young, I always had this idea of creating my own unique style of music on the violin. But I had never gone out to do it. I never shared it with anyone because I was scared of what people would think. Classical music to me seemed like this immovable 400-year-old force, right, with so much structure and history and tradition. And I grew up asking myself, who am I to challenge that? But this conversation, it moved me to challenge those beliefs and to view the music of Mozart and Beethoven not as the end-all be-all, not as everything, but as one person's beautiful perspective. And I learned to appreciate that I could offer my own to the world. And so around this time is when I began to compose my own music on the violin, including the piece that I just played for you. And in my work, in my creations, I aim to connect the classical world with melodies and rhythms from genres such as hip-hop and jazz that I also appreciate. And for me, after nearly 20 years with the instrument, I finally begun to bring my own unique sounds, my own unique vision to the world, instead of just playing notes that other people had written. The question I invite each of you to ask yourselves today is, when it comes to your life, when it comes to your path, when it comes to your profession in this industry itself, are you bringing new music to the world? Or are you just playing notes that have already been written in the past? Are you creating the sounds for tomorrow? Or are you just accepting the sounds, living within the sounds from yesterday? And when I say sounds, I literally mean the sounds. The inner voices that go on in your head. The spoken culture around your friend groups, your communities, your organizations, the limiting beliefs that something cannot be changed just because it's been done the same way for years. You see, ever since this conversation I had with my mother a few years ago, who I'm fortunate to say she's healthy and she's doing well now. Thank you. But ever since this conversation with her, I've been almost haunted with a question that remains in my mind every single morning. And that's, what would each of our lives look like if we didn't need a diagnosis from a doctor to realize that we need to act with urgency behind our ideas? And what would we be able to collectively create as groups, as families, as communities, as organizations, if we didn't need a diagnosis from a doctor to realize that we need to embrace new possibilities and bring all of ourselves to the world? I hope you don't mind me asking, but how old are you?
20.
Huh?
20.
20? Yeah. What's your name?
Malcolm Jackson.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So 20 years old. The average life expectancy in this country is 78. In 10 years, it's probably going to be 85. Can you imagine what your life would look like if for the next 60 years you woke up every single day feeling like you had nothing to lose? Feeling like whatever idea that you had to take action on it now. Can you imagine the music you would be able to create in your life? So this is the question I can't get out of my mind, because I see this opportunity in every single person. It's right there. Can you imagine? So a little bit more about me. I'm not just a violinist, and I'm not just a composer, but I'm also a speaker as well. And I share this message with people across the world. And for the last 2 years, I've spent a lot of my time reflecting thinking. And not just about my own transformation as an artist, but thinking, almost doing research on the mindset changes that happened in my mother pre-diagnosis and post-diagnosis. I'm a student, I'm just curious about what's the difference in someone's mind when they realize that they should bring their ideas to the world. And I've dedicated myself, I've spent the last year sharing my findings, sharing my message with people across the world. So in places like Amsterdam, Berlin, Mexico, and she said Disney, and I worked with the Seattle Seahawks, Russell Wilson, all those guys, I've spoken to them. And amongst all these people across the entire world, so many different fields and industries, everyone looking to find ways to bring more of themselves to the world, I found one common thread amongst everybody. And if you can do this, like, the world is literally yours. And that idea is this: make a practice of defining your purpose. Make a practice of defining your purpose. And I say make a practice of it because I believe that we are dynamic creatures, right? The purpose I have now is going to change in 5 or 10 years, right? But in anything you do, you have the opportunity to decide what you will take from it. Something my mom said that night was that if life were a river, she was just going with the flow, going with the current. She'd never put her own stake in the ground, right? She never determined her own course of direction. She was just waiting for other people in front of her to set the current, and she would just follow behind. She was waiting. And when she said this, I realized that I was doing the exact same thing in my life as a musician. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So, who here has gone to see an orchestra perform live before? A lot of people, okay. So maybe half the group. Now, for those who haven't, there's this very particular span of time that occurs between when the orchestra members take the stage and when the conductor takes the stage. And what happens is, before the real music starts, and while the audience members are filing in, taking their seats, all the players will come on stage and make random sounds and just warm up so that it's not silent and awkward as the audience waits. And when I was younger, when I was in an orchestra, this was my favorite part of the show. Let me tell you why. While the people to my right and the people to my left would be, warming up to the Beethoven that we were about to perform, I would use this time for a slightly different reason. I remember I would sit back in my chair, and off the top of my head, I would just kind of improv. I would jam, and I would come up with these different kind of jazz-infused rhythms. And I would sit back, and I would look out into the audience, and I would pretend like everyone was there to see me. Right? This was my showtime in my mind. And I would do this every single show, and even though no one in the audience could hear me from anyone else, in my mind, they were always loving it, right? And so we would be on stage doing this for about 5 or 10 minutes, making random sounds. And then all of a sudden, the lights would dim. Everyone in the audience would get really quiet. This meant it was time for the conductor to take the stage. And so we'd all sit up straight, button our jackets. And the conductor would proudly walk from behind stage and take the podium and raise his hands. And this meant it was time for the real music to begin. He would wave his hands and we would start playing. But this is the exact point when my energy would drop. This is the point when my spirit would fade. Because my spirit was with that other music. That music that nobody heard. And I remember after each performance, I would go home and I would look back. When I would be playing this music on stage, I would write it on the sheet music, right? And I would go home after each performance and I would look back at the notes I had written. I would marvel at them and I would hope that one day a conductor would raise his or her hands to start my music. But it never happened. And so I would wait, and I would wait, and I would wait. But it really wasn't until this conversation with my mother that I realized I could not afford to wait any longer. I believe that so many of us, we wait for a conductor, someone external, someone else to legitimize and approve what we can bring to the world. We wait for someone else to put their stamp on the sounds, the ideas, the music that we can offer. And I want to tell you today that each of you, especially the scholars today, that you yourself are your own personal brand that only you can define. Not your friends, not even your parents, not your mentors. Only you can define that, not the world around you. Now, when the world looks at me, let's be honest, they don't see a violinist. They might see a basketball player. And yeah, I play basketball. But they definitely don't see a violinist. Like I said, I started playing the violin. I started playing when I was 3 years old. And I've had hundreds of experiences of people telling me what I could and could not do because of the way I looked. I remember middle school. I was the only black student in the Maryland All-State Orchestra. A sea of 150 other white and Asian students. I was the only black student there. People coming up to me, surprised, telling me black people don't play the violin. Kids can be mean. They really mean. Remember high school? It was the first day of school one year, and I went to go to the music center to pick up my violin to take it home so I could practice that same violin right there. There was a new teacher at school. He didn't know who I was. It was the first day. I go to pick up the violin. He says, "Stop, wait." He thought I was stealing. That violin right there that I've had for almost 10 years, he thought I was stealing. And these experiences, they hurt. They hurt. They make me feel like the other. Like the world that's right around me is not for me. They hurt. But I decided at a very early age, that these experiences were not going to be a source of any self-doubt. And I decided at a very early age that these experiences were not going to be a source of my anger towards the world, even though it might be warranted. But I made the decision that each one of these experiences of someone trying to stereotype me or put me in a box, that each of these experiences were going to be the primary source of my confidence. Because when they happen, in my mind, here's what happens. I don't get mad. I don't get angry. I don't even try to prove them wrong. I just smile internally. Because I know with 100% certainty that I'm going to do whatever it takes to be the very best at what I do. And I know with 100% I know with 100% certainty that if I do that, there's going to be a day. It may not be today, and it might not be tomorrow, but there's going to be a day where that person who tried to limit me is going to see me doing what I love at the highest level. And the only thing they're going to be able to do is sit back and say, "Damn, I was wrong." And I know that's going to happen. Guys, I'm 23 years old. I'm 23. I graduated from Stanford 13 months ago to this day on the Bay Area. I graduated 13 months ago. And as graduation was approaching, I had this idea that I could be a speaker, that I could offer something to say. And, not just speak at, middle schools and elementary schools and high schools, even though I do that, not just to do that. There's a lot of college-age students that are doing that. But I had the idea in my mind that I could be international, that I could have something to say to some of the most important organizations in the world. I had that idea. And it just so happened that as graduation was approaching, one of my friends that I knew since I was 14 years old was coming out to Stanford to hang out for a weekend. And he asked me what I was going to do. He had a job lined up already. And he asked me what I was going to do, and I told him. And he was just like, I hate to break it to you, but that's just not a thing. That's what he said. He said, it's not a thing. He said, I mean, no one's going to hire you to do this. No one's going to pay you to do that. What are you thinking? You know what he said, too? Because he already had a job lined up. So he even offered that I could stay on his couch while I figured out my next move, because it wasn't going to happen. And I'm sure we've all had experiences where the people closest to us are the first to limit our ideas. Right? So many ideas die that way. And so he said this. We were actually driving in the car. He was driving my car at the time. I don't know why. But he said this, and I didn't try to argue him back. I didn't get mad. I didn't doubt what I was trying to do. I just kind of nodded and said, interesting. All right. Well, then we talked about something else. But I was smiling. I was laughing internally because I knew I had a plan in place and that eventually he was just going to sit back and watch. And so you know what happened 4 weeks ago, exactly a year after my graduation, 4 weeks ago, was when I was up at the Seattle Seahawks organization with all the different players there. And after I presented there, I posted a picture on Instagram with one of the players, Jimmy Graham, the new tight end they had. This kid was the first person to text me. And all he said was, you proved me wrong, and maybe the world's a little bit bigger than I thought. You see what happened? When you don't just go with the current of what other people think, and when you set your own intention, you not only do great things, and you not only prove people wrong, and yeah, that feels nice, but you can change mindsets. You can change the way people perceive the world around them, and that is the greatest impact you can make as a human, I believe. And I just want to say that anyone here, especially the scholars, if you find yourself in a position where someone is trying to limit you, where someone's trying to stereotype you or put you in a box, you don't have to fight back. You don't have to prove them wrong or anything like that. Just smile and say, interesting. And know that you have the greatest power in changing the way they perceive the world by what you bring to the world yourself. I know I'm probably over time, but I just want to share one last idea. A lot of people ask me where I get my inspiration from. A lot of people ask me where I get my energy from. I'm up at 5 or 6 a.m. every morning, responding to emails, writing content, doing what I need to do to get to that next level, working on music. Where do I get my inspiration from? This Thursday, I'm driving down with my family to a family reunion down in South Carolina. And that's where you can find the answers to those questions. Because my inspiration, my energy comes from knowing where I come from. It comes from knowing my history. It comes from knowing the generations of my ancestors that went through the most degrading circumstances and made it through with passion because they had the hope that one day I could be in the position that I am today. It comes from knowing that my great-grandparents and my grandparents did not have the possibility of going to college. Stanford was not an option. But you know what they did? They worked multiple jobs, barely making more than a few dollars an hour to this day because they had the hope that one day I could do something greater, and all you're telling me is all I have to do is wake up at 5 a.m. to check some emails. That's easy. Who am I not to do that? Who are we not to bring all of ourselves to the world every single day. Who are we not to do that? So I've done a little research, and this industry, transportation, is one of the largest in the world. The need of transportation, it's like food and water, it's not going anywhere. The possibilities are endless. I just want to tell the scholars here today that whatever your aspiration is, maybe it's another internship, another program next summer, maybe it's a GPA that you want by the end of graduation, maybe it's that first job after graduation. You can do 10 times more, whatever it is. 10 times more. Don't ever doubt the greatness that you come from and the greatness that is within you. And realize that you're not doing this alone. It's not happening in isolation at all. If you look around the room right now, the people that are behind me, people that invited you here, all around the room, you're not here to stand in their shadows. You're here to stand on their shoulders. You're not... You weren't brought here just to accept their ideas, accept what they've done, and be fine with that. You're here because you have the potential to take their ideas to a new level, to add your own twist, to write new music in the world, whatever that means to you. I'd like to close out by playing one more piece for you all tonight. It's an original composition I wrote last year that a few of you may have heard, and I add my own twist to something from the past. It's my own variation of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal.